Good afternoon, everybody. So this video is going to be looking at the first two chapters that we've read out of this particular text, Mestiza Scripts, Digital Migrations in the Territories of Writing by Damian Baca. We're going to be looking, this video specifically is looking at chapters 1 and 2, the introduction in chapter 2. Again, in your discussions post, you all did really well. I saw that there were a few questions on the reading, so I'm going to just use this video to kind of go over a few of the concepts to make sure we're all on the same page and kind of put it in conversations with the previous readings that we've had from Anzaldúa, as well as Horner and Alvarez, and this concept of translinguality. So we'll go ahead and get into it by starting with chapter 1, the introduction. So Mestiza Scripts and the Rhetoric of Subversion. So if we think about this from a rhetorical reading perspective, chapter 1 is really, the purpose of chapter 1 is to inform the readers of the topic, the purpose and methods used to achieve the purpose of the book, and provides a short outline of the chapters and the conclusions of Baca's study. And so that's the purpose of this introduction chapter. It's trying to kind of situate the book, and obviously it's written for rhetorical scholars. The argument that Baca is presenting in his book, and he has this on page 1, this book argues that Mestiza's scripts subvert and revise hierarchical narratives of assimilation through symbolic mediation and border crossing. And again, he quote, "My aim is to illuminate the ways Mestizaje inscriptions significantly revise dominant narratives of assimilation in order to critique enduring power structures and ensure culture." So Baca's purpose in this book is really to try to advocate for this new kind of way of thinking, looking at Mestiza scripts and how those scripts will revise dominant narratives of assimilation. So how he's going to do that, this volume points to the ways that Mestiza rhetorics have continually worked to create, quote, new literacies, new ways of speaking, writing, and reading that promote anti-colonial translations and revisions of colonial narratives. My hope is not only to influence emerging rhetoric and composition scholarship on borderland cultures, but also point to literacy practices that might actually be prioritized in increasingly diverse classrooms of 21st century America. I believe we need to learn how to read in new ways. So he's going to take this concept of Mestiza rhetorics, and he's going to put that in conversation with how to create, or that we need to create this new idea, this idea of new literacies, new ways of speaking, writing, and reading that promote anti-colonial translations. And that's what he's putting forth as the argument for the book. And in the first chapter, he's kind of letting us know that that's what this book will be focusing on. How he's going to do that, his method and theory, is that he's going to be using Gloria Anzaldúa's concept of the new Mestiza consciousness to analyze how Mesoamerica and Western cultural materials intersect and interact to produce new possibilities through a dynamic strategy of Mestiza invention. The study of Mestiza culture, therefore, can refer to the analysis of variable ways this group interacts through material and symbolic means. Analyzing Mestiza culture, then, involves studying how it is enacted as an everyday practice in the construction, articulation, and interpretation of those meanings. So he's telling us that he's going to use the new Mestiza consciousness that we read from Anzaldúa's piece to look at different artifacts to kind of see what are their points of interest. So what he's saying is that he's going to use Anzaldúa's concept of the new Mestiza consciousness to create a new way of thinking about these various literacies. So he states, I advance Anzaldúa's new Mestiza consciousness as an analytic for understanding Mestiza rhetorics. By perpetually transitioning between worldviews, cultural, economic, spiritual, gendered, and erotic, Mestiza consciousness offers the possibilities of, quote, thinking and writing from the intersection of Mesoamerica and Western perspectives, where their collective expressions emerge. So that's what he's planning to do, and that's what he's setting up in chapter 1. Outside of kind of telling us this, he's also giving us a few of the definitions of terms that he's going to use throughout his text. So he defines Mestiza, and I have that definition for you here on the screen. So he defines Mestiza as consisting of a dynamic spectrum of shifting and contested subjectivities. At one extreme of this continuum are people who understand their individual and communal identity as primarily indigenous. At the other extreme are those who deny indigenous affiliations and instead see themselves within the larger isolated Spanish-Iberian inheritance of the past 400 or 500 years in America. So he acknowledges that this is Mestiza. These are the people he's speaking about when he uses this term. And throughout, he's going to use Mexican, Chicano, and Latino, but they're inclusive but separate from the spectrum. Again, defining Mestiza is an expression that also alludes to the larger milieu of Latinidad across the Americas and the Caribbean at large, though the scope of this book attends to the scripts and cultures of Mexican origin people who live north of the militarized border who have been familiar with the dominant culture for quite some time. So even though Mestiza can be used to kind of cover all of these different cultural groups, his particular text is looking at specifically Mexican origin peoples. All right, so he also provides a definition of Mestiza scripts. What is it that he's going to be looking at? So in Mestiza scripts for Baca are the practices of painting in books and inscribing on architecture. They are the texts that speak to Mesoamerican past while simultaneously addressing the colonial present. And so that's going to be the subject of his piece, of his text, of his book. But he also provides a definition of culture, how he's envisioning culture. So there are several different angles that are informing his definition of culture. He cites culture as a meaning-making practice or experience whereby people use shared symbols to mediate and legitimize lived experience. Culture can also be a dynamic constellation of practices composed of tangible and intangible components with 4 fundamentals. They could be material objects, perceptions and ideas, phenomenal behavior and events, and regulations that organize and maintain society. Therefore, after these 2 kind of influences, culture then refers specifically to the affective lived traditions and practices of the colonial borderlands with an emphasis on ritual, dance, and writing. So that's what he's going to be looking at for his particular book. And he's looking at Mestiza scripts to kind of create this idea of a Mestiza rhetorics. And this Mestiza rhetorics is going to come out of his analysis of these artifacts and looking at them through the new Mestiza consciousness concept that Anzaldúa created. And he's advocating that Mestiza rhetorics are discursive manifestations of continuity and adaptation that compromise this new social realities while at the same time retaining roots in older Mesoamerican civilization survival. Rather than attempting to preserve or recreate a Mesoamerican authenticity, Mestiza rhetorics are going to generate a new vision of history and subjectivity. He also discusses this concept of inventing between. So utilizing his concept of Mestiza rhetorics, this book is going to enact a strategy of invention between different ways of knowing. The strategy implied here involves what I describe as inventing in between, the hierarchical tensions of Western and Mesoamerican practice. He states, my analysis shows such Mestiza rhetorical practices create symbolic spaces in which it becomes possible to understand multiple local histories, memories, and the rhetoric coexisting. Mestiza rhetorics defy hierarchical binaries by creating permeable ways of crossing and inventing between colonial oppositions. Furthermore, these rhetorics offer powerful critiques of the dominant stories of assimilation, colony, and the border in an age where things are hotly contested. So that's it for chapter 1. He's kind of setting up what this book is going to be about. He's defining his terms for us. He's letting us know what the purpose of the book is going to be and what his subject of analysis is. All right, now for chapter 2, we're going to discuss New Consciousness, Ancient Myths. And I have several slides here for you all to kind of go through on your own time. But I wanted to kind of stop here and just kind of discuss this for a moment. So Mestiza consciousness as rhetorical strategy. So here, Baca is advocating that a Mestiza consciousness is a unique Mestiza strategy of invention. Mestiza consciousness is a borderland articulation that emerges specifically from the underside of colonial relations of power. He's advocating that Mestiza consciousness as a rhetorical strategy invites readers not only to think with, against, and beyond the first language to impose rhetoric instruction proper in America, but that Mestiza consciousness as a rhetorical strategy effectively challenges the first wide-scale colonialist pedagogy of writing. And he's advocating that a Mestiza consciousness can create a new rhetorical tradition. So if writing specialists today accept Anzaldúa's Mestiza consciousness as a starting point, then the possibilities for accessing rhetorical and pedagogical potentials no longer constrained by dichotomous frameworks of Western expansion become available. If in place of theorizing rhetoric and writing based on Western narrative and Mestiza consciousness is advanced as a point of origin, scholars might be encouraged to think about, practice, and teach rhetoric in ways that are directly responsive to comparative developments of writing. So here, building off of the readings that we've done up to this point in the semester, we're really looking at translinguality. We're looking at how that can be utilized within classrooms and digital spaces. And we're thinking about Ansel Dua's pieces of How to Tame a Wild Tongue and the New Mestiza Consciousness. And we're trying to place all of these conversations together. And Baca is trying to do in his piece is kind of recenter. So just like we do with translinguality, if we create a new center for language usage, Baca is trying to advocate if we have a new center for how we think about rhetorical traditions, how does that change how we think about language usage? How does that change how we think about rhetorical theory if we're looking at various artifacts who may be different or challenging or pushing out our explanations of what can be considered in the Western rhetorical tradition? And so the theme from these readings up to this point in the semester is really trying to get us to think about how do we, if we can recenter our center, we can think about a new point of center, and we can really think about what is actually happening in language use. How do we then create theories that actually explain what is happening in our language usage? And so these texts are kind of building on that and continuing that conversation. All right, that's it for today. If you have any questions on any of the readings from this week, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to discuss these concepts with you further.